The Generations After the Manifesto, which received the Best Book of 2007 award from the John Whitmer Historical Association. In addition, he co-authored the 1992 publication, The Priesthood of Modern Polygamy, an LDS Perspective, and is webmaster of MormonFundamentalism.com. Brian works as an anesthesiologist at the Davis Hospital and Medical Center in Layton, Utah, where he serves as secretary of the medical staff. He also served as president of the Davis County Medical Society in 2009. He's an active member of the church. There's more in his bio you can read, but I'm going to give the time to Brian. And the title of his presentation is Joseph Smith's Sexual Polyandry and the Emperor's New Clothes. On closer inspection, what do we find? With that, I'd like to welcome Brian Hales.
Thank you, Scott. I'm very privileged to be able to present here at FAIR. I admire all of the officers and those that put these conferences together each year, and again feel it a privilege to be able to discuss a few things. I hope that what I say will be helpful to you, and I apologize, but not really, for this shameless plug that I have put on the screens in front of you of my it says 2 volumes, but I was told by Lloyd Erickson it actually may end up being 3 volumes, just because volume 1 was going to be over 1,000 pages. So we're just getting to the typesetting part of it, though. So by the end of the year, hopefully these volumes will be out. Now, the title is Joseph Smith's Sexual Polyandry and the Emperor's New Clothes. On closer inspection, what do we find? People often ask me, Brian, why are you so interested in polygamy? And of course, then I have others who come up and say, Brian, why are you so interested in polygamy? And to those, I can't even monog, so you don't need to worry about me wanting to polyg, okay? But actually, there is some history there. I have a member of my family who was excommunicated in 1989 for joining a polygamist group. And she's since left that group, hasn't rejoined the church, but she's no longer in with them. But in 1991, I wrote this book, and you can't see it very well, but it's the Priesthood of Modern Polygamy, an LDS Perspective. And if I tell people that my books are, I'm an anesthesiologist, and that my books are part of my full anesthesia services. And if ever that were true, this is it. And of course, we do have this problem. We've just had a nice snack, and there's a thing in medicine called postprandial narcolepsy, and postprandial is after you eat, narcolepsy is inappropriate sleeping. And I'll be honest with you, if you fall asleep during my talk, I won't be offended, but I have spent this entire morning putting people to sleep and sending them bills for that service. So just be aware, okay? I do have 3 other books, and I'm mentioning this just because I noticed they had a few copies in the bookstore, and they aren't on polygamy, but they have some pretty good doctrinal basis regarding the individual titles that they have. And then in 2006, I wrote a couple of other books on Mormon fundamentalism, and over half the questions that people would ask me about polygamy had to do with Joseph Smith's polygamy, and I just didn't know the answers. And so in 2007, I jumped back in, and the topic that actually got me involved was polyandry. It's like I just couldn't figure out how Joseph could be married to somebody else's wife. It just didn't click for me. 5 years later, and a lot of time and monetary expenditure, we're coming together with some ideas that you're going to be able to hear today. And here again is my shameless plug for these upcoming books. My research supports that 14 of Joseph Smith's plural wives had legal husbands. It could be that in Joseph Smith's history, polygamy is the most difficult thing to understand. And then within polygamy, Joseph Smith's sealings to legally married women is the most difficult. So we're talking about a pretty tough subject today. And I can tell you already that if it were easy, somebody would have already explained it decades ago. But I think we've got it figured out, but it's going to require some discussion. Now, there's 2 questions. Why did he do it? And did the women really have 2 husbands? Well, answering the question of why he did it requires us to introduce some new topics. Now, Joseph taught that marriage can be eternal and that everyone must be sealed in order to be exalted. These are not new to us. We've all heard these, but outside of Mormondom, These are kind of new ideas. Emanuel Swedenborg had talked about eternal marriage, and he died in 1772, but really nobody talked about eternal marriage. But the idea that you had to be married to get salvation, the highest salvation, that's still a really new and somewhat different teaching. To answer the question why is simply that the 14 women, when they learned about eternal marriage, they chose Joseph Smith to be their eternal husband. It's that simple. They chose him over the men that they were married to. 4 of the women couldn't be sealed to their legal husbands because those husbands were not active Latter-day Saints, but the remaining 10, whose husbands were active LDS, chose Joseph. So some observations. It's kind of weird that a woman would be married to an active LDS but be sealed to Joseph Smith for an eternal marriage. And Joseph could be criticized that he was insensitive to those 10 husbands, but none of them ever complained. We have no complaints from any of them. And then there could be suspicions that Joseph coerced the women, but these are not supported by any kind of documentation. None of the women complained, and we have good documentation that Joseph taught that the woman's desires should be respected in every case. And there are at least 5 cases where women turned him down, and the only reason we know about it is because those women later talked about it. Joseph didn't talk about it. He didn't try to destroy their reputation. He didn't castigate them. He just let it go because that was their choice. Now, the question is, did the women really have 2 husbands after their sealings to Joseph Smith? Well, according to his teachings, the answer is no. You see, Joseph Smith taught that celestial and plural marriage were part of the new and everlasting covenant. He also taught that all old covenants have I caused to be done away in this thing, and this is a new and everlasting covenant. The covenant that was then being discussed was baptism, and we have no record of Joseph Smith applying this principle to the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, but we also have no record of him contradicting it or saying that it didn't apply. The Revelation simply says all old covenants are done away in the new and everlasting covenant. Accordingly, a sealing in the new and everlasting covenant would supersede a legal matrimonial covenant, causing it to be done away. A woman who contracts both a legal marriage covenant and an eternal sealing for time and eternity would not thereafter have 2 lawful husbands, lawful in God's eyes, with whom she could experience sexual relations. So if a woman did not have 2 husbands after being sealed to Joseph, were their civil husbands suddenly disfranchised from the marriage? And the answer again is no. But to understand how this works, we're going to introduce some new ideas. Historical evidence shows that legally married women could be sealed to somebody else for eternity only, somebody other than their civil husband. And if you've read Compton, if you've read Mike Quinn, they both say, no, these never happened. There's none recorded in the 19th century. Well, guess what? Since those books were written, there is evidence. This is the handwriting of Andrew Jensen, who was an independent researcher at the time, and he later became an assistant church historian. But he says, while the strongest affection sprang up, and he's interviewing one of Joseph Smith's plural wives. We don't know which one, and this is occurring in 1887 early. But he said he's interviewing this wife. It's probably Eliza Snow, but we don't know. While the strongest affection sprang up between the prophet Joseph and Mr. Sayers. Mr. Sayers is the husband, the legal husband of Ruth Vos Sayers, one of Joseph's plural wives. The latter, Mr. Sayers, not attaching much importance to the theory of a future life, insisted that his wife Ruth should be sealed to the prophet for eternity. As he himself should only claim her in this life, she was accordingly sealed to the prophet in Emma's presence, and thus she was numbered among the prophet's plural wives. And there are other evidences, eternity-only sealings, as strange as they are to us today, because we don't do them today. And there were only a few done in Nauvoo, but the new and everlasting covenant allows a sealing for this life and the next, or just the next life. And there were a few of those performed. The women who were sealed just for the next life, like Ruth Vos Sayers, are on Joseph's list of wives, but technically they don't belong there until we get into the next realm. But we have to deal with it today. So were all 14 of these women sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity only? No. It's not that easy. At least 3 of the sealings were for time and eternity, and in a covenant that superseded the legal covenant. In other words, after the sealing to Joseph, the legal husband was not going to be able to experience conjugality with her. They're special cases, and there's not a lot of parallels between the three. We're going to talk about all three of them. The first one is Sylvia Sessions Lyon. If you've read Todd Compton's book In Sacred Loneliness, you know that he goes in several pages and he elaborately unfolds a plausible case. But new evidence suggests that he is in error. And I've talked with him. I emailed him this past week about it, and he still defended it at Sunstone when I presented this just a week ago. He was the respondent. But you just can't do it, and you'll see why here in a minute. But Sylvia married Windsor Lyon on April 21st, 1838, in a legal ceremony performed by Joseph Smith. Todd uses the date of February 8th, 1842 as their sealing date, and that's the first problem. The daughter was conceived over a year later, on May 18th, 1843, and this daughter, I believe, is Joseph Smith's actual daughter. The assumption is that Sylvia experienced sexual relations with both Windsor and Joseph Smith during this period. Now, there's no evidence for that, for either one of them during the period up until Josephine was conceived, but the willingness of people to assume these things is very high, as we'll talk about in a minute. But the problem is that Todd uses this date here of 42, but in the same set of documents, and Todd didn't know this when he wrote his book because he didn't have time to get to this. This is book 4, but there's an 1843 date. I don't know if you can see that over there, but there's 42 and there's 43. They're equally valid or invalid. They're not signed. They talk about this marriage, but we don't know how close Sylvia Sessions Lyon was to the creation of these documents, and they just cancel each other out. The whole timeline presented by Todd, I would argue, is not reliable. But there is one other evidence that Todd will cite that to say that Sylvia Sessions was sealed to Joseph early, and that is that she witnessed the sealing of her mother in March of 42. Now, that clearly indicates that Sylvia was a polygamy insider. But the problem is that I've identified 17 other men and women who are not polygamists who did witness these marriages. It's just not strong evidence. So the whole timeline that Todd presents, which is more or less a plausible course of sexual polyandry, I believe just falls apart. Windsor was excommunicated in November of 1842. We have three evidences that the sealing occurred after this, and that the excommunication of Windsor caused him and Sylvia to part. They were already separated. So we're talking about they're legally married, but they separate, and then Joseph is sealed to Sylvia after the excommunication. In a document undoubtedly used to write his 1887 historical record article on plural marriage, Andrew Jensen wrote, Sylvia Sessions was married to Mr. Lyon. When he left the church, she was sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith. Elsewhere, he refers to Sylvia as formerly the wife of Windsor Lyons. In 1915, Josephine, the child, related that back in 1882, just months before her mother died, she told Josephine in a very dramatic fashion that she had been sealed to the prophet at the time that her husband, Mr. Lyon, was out of the fellowship with the church, and that Joseph Smith was actually Joseph's daughter. And Josephine married a guy named Fisher, and there's a whole Fisher family in Bountiful that descend from this. And I've been in contact with some of the descendants, and they're starting to say, hey, maybe we need to make a claim that we're actually coming from Joseph and not from Windsor Lyon. And it'll be interesting, but in my research, there's only 2 children from the plural wives. This is one. The other is Olive Frost's daughter or son. We don't even know the gender. Both Olive Frost and the child died before they left Nauvoo, and that's all. There's references to a third. Don't know. Maybe some new evidence will come up and we'll find out. But looking at the timeline, we find that Windsor and Sylvia married in 38. She conceives 3 children, then he's excommunicated, and that's when they separate. It's not a legal divorce, but she is then sealed to Joseph in a marriage that I argue would have superseded the legal marriage anyway, which would have curtailed any conjugality between Sylvia and Windsor. Josephine is conceived, Joseph Smith is killed, Windsor is rebaptized, and then they come back together. The legal marriage is still intact. Now, is this weird? Is this weird? Yeah, this is weird, okay? But is it sexual polyandry? Is it immoral? Is it breaking the law of chastity that Joseph taught? No, it isn't. And we're going to see more of this kind of thing, but it's real people like you and me struggling with a really tough commandment. Now, the second case of the 14, remember I say there are 3 of them that were time and eternity, and I think the rest were all eternity only. But the second case is Mary Heron. And she will be new to most everybody here, I would guess, because the only people that even mention her are Quinn in the back of one of his things, and She's also mentioned by Compton, but just briefly. So stay with me. It's a little complicated, and we don't have a lot of information, but Joseph Ellis Johnson was involved in an adulterous relationship. His membership status was discussed in a council meeting September 2nd, 1850 in Salt Lake City, Brigham Young presiding. In his defense, Joseph E. Johnson reported that he was familiar with the first frigging, which is slang for sexual relations, that was done in his house with his mother-in-law by Joseph. His mother-in-law was Mary Heron Snyder. Despite intensive research, I have found no additional evidence. And this is an area, if we've got researchers out there, I'm hoping people will be able to find new things, because we've looked really hard. I had Don Bradley, who was I employed as a research assistant for a while, and he was on it for several weeks trying to find anything connecting these two, couldn't do it. Now, John Snyder, Mary Heron's legal husband, was on a mission to England from March of 42 to January of 43. Now, Joseph E. Johnson did not build his house in Ramus till 1843. So to say that Joseph sent him on a mission so he could have this rendezvous and marry Mary Heron is not supported. But there are several interpretations that are possible depending upon what you're willing to assume, because we have so little data. Now, the first is a willingness to assume that Joseph E. Johnson was accurate and accurately quoted. Joseph E. Johnson was Benjamin F. Johnson's brother. They were a very prominent family in the church. I think he's telling the truth. I believe it. I'm willing to make this assumption. But the next assumptions you're willing to make are very important, because if you assume there was no plural sealing, that Joseph is just involved with Mary Heron without any kind of a marriage, then it's adultery. If you want to assume there was a plural sealing and that she was also having conjugal relations with her legal husband, then it's sexual polyandry. And this is what Michael Quinn is promoting and believes happened. If you believe that a plural sealing did occur, causing the legal marriage to be done away, the civil husband thereafter serving as some kind of a front husband for Joseph Smith, then the relationship is a consecutive marriage. Now, here's some observations. None of the leaders who heard Joseph E. Johnson's 1850 statement seemed concerned. There's just nothing in the notes to tell us that there's any problems. John and Mary endured long periods apart after leaving Nauvoo. John and Mary stopped having children in 1833, either due to Mary's infertility or to the absence of sexual relations, because after her death, John Snyder remarried and had children. Mary died in 1852 and was never sealed to John Snyder during their lifetimes. And John lived to 1875 and had plenty of opportunities to seal either while they were both living or by proxy. This did not occur. Lastly, John Snyder lived in Salt Lake and remained a devout believer throughout his life. John Taylor wrote his obituary, extolling how good of a member he was. So you could argue he knew nothing about what was going on, which is unlikely, or that he knew what was going on and it didn't shake his testimony. So going back to the assumptions, just take your pick. We don't know. It's a real puzzler. Because of the lack of historical documentation, the exact nature of Joseph Smith's relationship with Mary Heron is indefinable currently. So maybe we'll get some more information. The case of Sarah Ann Whitney, who was the legal wife of Joseph C. Kingsbury, is much better documented, and you may have heard of her. She married Joseph Smith in a time and eternity sealing in July of 1842. They may have been involved sexually. We don't know. There's no actual reference to it, but we have the prayer that was used to seal them, and it refers to the possibility of progeny. So it could have happened. She is on my list of 12 women that I think probably was sexually involved with Joseph. 9 months later, after the sealing, and for reasons that we still don't know, Joseph went to Joseph C. Kingsbury, a bachelor in Nauvoo, and asked him to legally marry Sarah Ann and to portray themselves as a married couple throughout Nauvoo, and they did. They moved in under the same roof. They went around as if they were married, but Kingsbury later referred to the nuptial as a pretended marriage, indicating that it was never consummated, and, kind of comically, in 1880, he submitted a bill for $8,000 to the church for his financial support of Sarah Ann. Now, we don't know for sure, but it doesn't appear John Taylor paid the bill. So, based upon the best assumptions, and again, I apologize, I wish we had more evidence. But if we go over the 14 women who had legal husbands, here's my take. And again, we're having to do some assuming. But what we have is these three women, and I apologize, well, maybe I could switch back and forth, but these three women are married to non-members. Norman Buell was an antagonist. And then the context of this marriage, and we'll read about it in a minute, is that it was eternity only. So I think these are eternity only sealings. These top 5 are pretty clearly eternity only. And then we have these three that we just talked about, which are not eternity only. They're actually time and eternity, where the husband could serve as a front husband like Kingsbury. Windsor Lyon was kind of out of the picture, and we don't know anything about John Snyder. But these six in between are interesting because all of these husbands are devout Latter-day Saints. And you have to ask the question, if their wives had chosen Joseph over them for eternity, would they also have been willing to let the woman marry Joseph for time and eternity and just hang around as a front husband? I don't think so for these top three. Patty Bartlett, Elizabeth Davis, Lucinda Pendleton, I think these were eternity only as well. But these three, Elvira Coles, Miranda Nancy Johnson, and Zina Diantha Huntington right here, we have two sealing dates for Miranda and Zina. And it wouldn't surprise me if the first sealing date was actual and it was an eternity-only sealing. And then the second sealing date was, I'm going to be with Joseph in eternity. I think I'd just rather be with him for time and eternity too. Both of these husbands, Orson Hyde was an apostle, and Henry B. Jacobs says, whatever Joseph commands is right. So I think both of them would have been willing. Jonathan Holmes, there's a very dubious late account of Joseph coming up to him and saying, will you marry Elvira and be a front husband for me? Just like with Joseph Kingsbury. It's late, it's not very credible, I can't find out anything about the guy who said it, but it is just so spot on in the request that it's just hard to totally ignore. So what do we know? Not as much as we'd like. But this is kind of the way that I would put the pieces together. Now, the question comes up, did Joseph Smith practice sexual polyandry? Well, guess what? I feel kind of alone. What is sexual polyandry? Just to make sure that we are all talking about the same things. Polyandry means many men. It doesn't necessarily mean many husbands. But when we talk about it in reference to polygamy, it's usually the implication is many husbands. It occurs when a woman experiences sexual relations with more than one man in a specific time period, or in this case, with more than one husband. So if you take that table that we just looked at and you present it to virtually everybody who has written on this topic, well, they would like to throw out all of this eternity only and sealing with the front husband stuff. And all of these authors just want to say, yeah, Joseph is sleeping with these women, and so is their legal husband. Sexual polyandry all the way up and down. So we need to investigate this idea of sexual polyandry a little bit. What did Joseph Smith teach about sexual polyandry? Does anybody think he taught anything about sexual polyandry? See, now we're getting into some of these ideas I mentioned earlier that are going to be new. But yeah, he did. He describes in section 132 three possible sexual polyandrous situations. And here's one of them. It's verses 61 through 63. As pertaining to the law of this law of the priesthood, if any man espouse a virgin, and if one after she is espoused shall be with another man, could be a legal husband, could be anybody, another man, she has committed adultery and shall be destroyed, for she is given unto him to multiply and replenish the earth. In other words, if a woman is sealed in an eternal marriage, if afterwards she is with even a legal husband, she commits adultery and shall be destroyed. It doesn't seem to matter if you reverse the order, which would apply to all but one of these marriages, and that is that she's legally married first, but then she is sealed, and then after the sealing, she's with her legal husband. Doesn't seem to make any difference, according to my reading. And maybe somebody's got a different reading, but the words are pretty plain. So we have three of them described there. Verses 41 and 42 are the other two. We won't discuss those, though if there's a question we can during the question and answer. But they label them all adultery. And see, this brings up the question that I would have for all of those people on the list saying that he did it or he might have done it. Well, the question is, if he did it, did he do it in accordance with his teachings, or was it in contradiction to his teachings? And of course, whichever answer they choose, there's a whole bunch of other questions to explain. Let's look at the evidence supporting and contradicting sexual polyandry in Joseph Smith's sealings to legally married women. Two categories of supportive evidence can be identified. Some authors have asserted, and this is a real late, just in the last 3 or 4 years, assertion, that sexual polyandry is required to fulfill the reproductive purpose of plural marriage. One author said that Joseph Smith's polygamy was all about sex. Well, not really. Joseph Smith gave 3 reasons for the establishment of plural marriage among the Latter-day Saints. The first was a restoration of Old Testament polygamy. And if somebody comes up to you and asks you, why did he do it? That's the answer you give, because it's easy. You can just point to Abraham. You can point to Jacob in the Old Testament. Joseph was a prophet restorer. He restored it. It's easy, it's not hard. But Joseph gave two other reasons. One is to multiply and replenish the earth, and that there are all of these noble and great premortal spirits, and they need devout families to be born into here on this earth. Now, if you tell that to a regular Christian, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. So that doesn't really work in that setting, but it works for us. And it's true, he did. He mentioned this several times. It's in section 132. And then the last one, which will be even less understood by even some Latter-day Saints, but certainly anybody out of the church, is that it will provide spouses for all worthy women. When Joseph taught that exaltation is only given to couples, either you have to have an exact same number of worthy women and men at the judgment, or you've got to make some kind of you have to provide for the option of there being more men or more women. And in this case, the only thing provided for in section 132 is that there will be more worthy women than men. Historically, in the 19th century, Americans considered non-traditional sexual relations, which would have included polyandry, as diminishing fecundity, which is fertility. They wouldn't have looked upon sexual polyandry as a way to multiply and replenish. In his 1841 book, Elements of Obstetric Medicine, Dr. David B. Davis wrote, "It is a general opinion, and one that would seem well-founded, that excess in the use of the means of impregnation," now how's that for politically correct language, "is upon the whole unfavorable to the interests of fecundity. Hence, the almost uniform sterility of the more public prostitutes." And actually, they were sterile because of sexually transmitted diseases. But in other words, Nauvoo sexual polyandry would not have been viewed as a way to multiply and replenish the earth to increase fertility, but in fact, it would have been viewed as a way to decrease it. So this argument just needs to go away. And then physiologically, adding a second sperm donor does not enhance a woman's fertility. And we can talk about that if you like. I'm not a gynecologist, but it's not that difficult. So let's look at the historical evidence. And I've been in emails. In fact, I was just downloading a paper from Michael Quinn. He just sent it to me this afternoon. He's writing an article defending the position that Joseph practiced sexual polyandry, and I hope whatever editor decides to publish it, they'll let me respond. Because I've heard his arguments, and he's been very kind in exchanging emails with me, but the evidence is just not there, brothers and sisters. This is from my website. It's josephsmithpolygamy.com if you want to go there. This is all of the evidences I could come up with, and I uploaded this a couple years ago, but there's a couple more things I'll talk about here in a minute. But there's just not a lot of good stuff here. There's no solid evidence. A few things you might call secondary evidence or supplemental evidence. But let's talk about a few of the things that are coming up and that I know Michael has talked about and Todd Compton as well. And this is the case of Mary Elizabeth Rawlins. Now, it's been asserted that Mary Elizabeth Rawlins, that in a letter written by Joseph F. Smith, he mentioned that there are some things that she would be unwise to make public. And the implication was it must be sexual polyandry or something like that. Well, no, it isn't. If you read about it, and this is kind of strange, but she received her endowments in Party P. Pratt's house, and then a second time in the Nauvoo Temple. That's what Joseph F. Smith didn't want her talking about. Okay, and you gotta can't blame him for that, but Party Pratt's house and the second time in the Nauvoo Temple. So problematic things. Then in 1892, Mary Elizabeth Rawlins wrote to John Henry Smith, who was a member of the 12, "If I could have an opportunity of conversing with you and Brother Joseph F. Smith, I could explain some things in regard to my living with Mr. Leitner, her legal husband, after becoming the wife of another, which would throw light on what now seems mysterious, and you would be perfectly satisfied with me." Well, it seems to me that if Mary Elizabeth Rawlins Leitner had reported to Apostle John Henry Smith that she had experienced sexual polyandry with Adam Leitner and with Joseph Smith, the apostle would not have been perfectly satisfied. And we'll talk more about here in a minute. But in a speech before the missionaries in 1905, she said, "I know that he, Joseph Smith, had 3 children. They told me. I think 2 are living today, but they are not known as his children as they go by other names." Michael Quinn affirms that she's talking about children of polyandrous wives, and there is absolutely no justification for that interpretation anywhere in this discourse that Mary Elizabeth Rawlins gave. And how he can do that, I've emailed him about it. It doesn't connect, but this is just misrepresentation. Now, the case of Flora Woodworth is interesting. On August 22nd, she was married to Joseph in the spring of 43. Don't have a date. on the 22nd of August, she has a confrontation with Emma. And Joseph had given her a gold watch. Emma took the watch and stamped it underfoot. I guess Emma wasn't real pleased with the plural marriage. The next day, Flora goes out and marries a non-member. Was this a reaction? I think absolutely it was. What she was thinking is hard to know. But then 3 days later, she and her mother converse with Joseph in the home of William Clayton. And it says right in there, they conversed some time. Well, she also meets Joseph on the 28th and the 29th in Clayton's home. And several authors have said, well, that was probably for sex. In fact, Michael Quinn, in his response to my paper up at Calgary, said it was such good sex that it made her immediately regret her marriage to Carlos Gov. Well, that's a bit of a stretch. I mean, because, you see, Flora's situation, and quite honestly, I don't think that marriage was ever consummated. If you look at Flora's behavior, even after the sealing in the spring there, the evidence that she wasn't respecting it is really high, and I argue it wasn't consummated. But if it was, this verse that we read earlier applies directly to her. A virgin who is married according to that law of the priesthood, if she is with another man, Carlos Gov, in this case, if Flora was with her legal husband, she has committed adultery and shall be destroyed. So it's my position that instead of having, rigorous sex according to some interpreters, these are talking about her status as far as her membership in the church. And you can honestly argue, if you're going to see sex in something like this is very neutral language, where will you not see it? We need some evidence from those who want to promote that position. Now, the case of Esther Dutcher, the legal wife of Albert Smith, is another new name. I accept all 33 of Todd Compton's plural wives, and I've added 2 more, Mary Herron, that we talked about, and Esther Dutcher. And I'm actually grateful to Michael Marquardt, who put me on to this. I didn't discover this on my own, but in a letter from Daniel Wells to Joseph F. Smith in 1888, he wrote that it seems that she, Esther Dutcher, was sealed to Joseph the prophet in the days of Nauvoo, though she still remained Albert Smith's wife. This is not George Albert Smith. This is somebody else you probably haven't heard of otherwise. Well, there's no sealing date. We don't know when the sealing occurred. I think the context of that letter is eternity only, but that's all that we have. But there is a son that was conceived during Joseph Smith's lifetime. He was born on September 21st, 1844. His name was Joseph Albert Smith. It's been argued that because the child was named Joseph Smith, that it must have been Joseph's son, and I'm thinking, I doubt it. I think that's really an extreme interpretation. And then why would you give it the middle name of the legal husband if that were the case? In addition, you're trying to hide these marriages. I mean, we didn't know about it. Nobody did till this letter popped up. And so if you're trying to hide a relationship between Esther and Joseph Smith, why would you name the son Joseph Smith? So there's some arguments against the idea that the name argues that Esther was sexually involved with Joseph. Again, here's a table. I've gone through all of the evidences from Michael Quinn. It's just assumption after assumption, and you'll probably hear more about that. If somebody bites and decides to publish it, hopefully I'll get to respond. Now, the case of Marianne Darrow Richardson is another one that's promoted by Larry Foster, and true to form, he did mention this in his presentation in Calgary at MHA. And I've emailed him and sent him information. It just keeps coming back. It just keeps on giving. So here's what we're doing. Here's what we've got with him. In 1840, Marianne Darrow marries Edward Richardson. Sometime prior to 1853, they become members of a church that says 2 children is all you should have, and he submits to a sterilization procedure. Then they are baptized, and in 1857 they're sealed. In 1858, Edward and Marianne, they want to have children in the covenant, and Brigham Young says the only way you can do that is to get a civil divorce where Marianne marries Frederick Cox legally. Frederick Cox didn't want to do it, by the way, but Brigham prevailed upon Frederick to do this, and Edward moves out of town. Okay, the evidence is strong that she's not living with both husbands. She has 2 children up to 1861. There's a legal divorce with from Frederick Cox, and then there's a legal marriage to Edward Richardson. Is this weird? Yeah, this is really weird. But is it people like you and me trying to deal with a really hard commandment? I think that really explains it. There's stumbling, there's challenges there. Now let's look at the contradictory evidence, and this is something that none of the proponents, you remember that list of everybody who says Joseph is doing it or maybe he's doing it, none of them have addressed these contradictory evidence, and maybe they can. It's out there, though, and it's something that maybe Michael will do so in his article. Observation 1 is that sexual polyandry is eyebrow-raising today. Is there anybody here who doesn't think it's just weird? I think we all agree. Well, in Illinois, in the 1840s and afterwards in Utah, it would have been scandalous. When asked in 1852, what do you think of a woman having more husbands than one, Brigham Young answered, this is not known in the law. 6 years later, Orson Pratt instructed, God has strictly forbidden in his Bible plurality of husbands and proclaimed against it in his law. And everything written about plurality of husbands in the 19th century condemns it. There's nothing that would support this behavior in any of the writings of the leaders. See, so when we run into these statements, and you've probably heard them before, but I wanted to mention them, Nettie Correa Smith, an anti-Mormon, asserted in 1860 that she'd heard Priscilla Huntington say afterwards in Utah that she did not know whether Mr. Buell, her legal husband, or the prophet was the father of her son. Or another anti-Mormon, Annie Liza Webb, alleged in 1875 that Zina Huntington said that the greatest trial of her life was to live with her husband and Joseph too at the same time. And then another anti-Mormon, Sarah Pratt, claimed in 1886 that Lucinda Pendleton stated in 1841, why, I am his mistress since 4 years. See, the problem with these types of statements is that they would have been saying, I'm an adulteress. That is the only way the hearers could have interpreted these kinds of statements. And for that reason, we've got some plausibility issues to deal with. Also, there's individual problems with all three of these quotations, whether they would have been in a position to hear it and many other things. And the fact that they're all anti-Mormons doesn't help their credibility either. Now, everybody knew, or virtually everybody, because this is not a secret thing. You can't say, well, they were just trying to keep it secret. No. John Bennett in 1842 listed several of Joseph Smith's plural wives. 3 of them were married, Mrs. Durfee, Mrs. Sessions, and Mrs. Buell. So people knew. They were asking the same questions then that you and I are asking today. And yet, according to all available documents, Joseph Smith did not explicate or defend it. No polyandrous wives personally reported it, defended it, or complained. No polyandrous husbands reported it, defended it, or complained. None of the officiators or witnesses reported it, defended it, or complained. Anti-Mormons did not complain until 1850, 9 years after it reportedly began. It's easy to understand why devout women would not have complained. But it is less obvious why participants would not have defended it if they had been practicing it. However, it is impossible to prove a negative, but this is important. That nobody mentioned it in any sense, I think, is an important observation. Second, 28 months after the first polyandrous sealing, and after dozens of people were aware of Joseph Smith's sealings to legally married women, he dictated Section 132 to explain why he introduced plural marriage. So we have here the first polyandrous sealing is October 27th, and then here are all 13 or 14 of the women. The ones in italics, we don't have a date for. I just kind of plugged them in there. But then he dictates section 132 right over here. Well, if Joseph Smith had been practicing sexual polyandry, he might have authorized that behavior in a verse in the Revelation. I mean, doesn't that make sense? Especially if he's just making this up for opportunities to expand his sexual involvement. But instead, the Revelation describes at least 3 potentially polyandrous situations, all define sexual polyandry as adultery. That's kind of curious behavior, isn't it? Observation 3, throughout the 19th century, polyandry was a non-issue when discussing Joseph Smith's plural marriages. Some of you are familiar with the affidavit books. That was what the 2 documents were from dealing with Sylvia Sessions' Lion. There were 4 of them. Joseph F. Smith kept 2 in his personal possession. 2 were kept with the church. They were identical. But when you go through them to try to figure out, well, are they trying to hide polyandrous unions? Are they trying to explain them or defend them? There's nothing. There's just no attempt. The yellow ones are the ones that are polyandrous. They're just plopped in there. Let's just get that Joseph was sealed to other women. That seems to be the focus here. And then fast forward 18 years to 1887, the plural marriage article that was the first attempt by anybody in the church to put the pieces together, and it didn't happen until 87, which is really curious because a lot of time had passed. But if you go through the individuals who left their testimonies and their statements and things, there's just no attempt to segregate the relationships that were polyandrous to those that were not. Of the 25 wives named by Jensen, 9 were polyandrous. 5 were identified by their maiden names, 2 identified by their married names. Elvira A. Coles is inaccurately identified afterwards as the wife of Jonathan H. Holmes. Ruth Ruth DeVos is identified as known as the wife of Edward Sayers, blatantly polyandrous, but nobody seems to be bothered by this. The observation that polyandry was a non-issue in the 19th century could be explained several different ways, one being that sexual polyandry was not practiced in Nauvoo. Fourth observation is that in 1892, the RLDS Church claimed to be a successor to Joseph Smith's True Church and sued the Church of Christ Temple Lot to gain possession of the Independence, Missouri Temple Lot. See, this is the stone church of the RLDS. Here's the Temple Lot, and this is the building of the Church of Christ Temple Lot. Temple Lot's right here. The Church of Christ, the stone chapel of the RLDS. The Church of Christ Temple Lot sought to show that Joseph Smith taught and practiced full sexual polygamy, and since the RLDS Church did not, they were not the actual successors. It's really kind of a simple thing. And the LDS Utah Church supported the Church of Christ Temple Lot. They didn't want the RLDS Church to get the lot anyway, but they arranged for the witnesses to testify of their polygamous relationships with the prophet. And the issue of sexual relations was paramount. Spiritual marriages, eternity-only sealings, and unconsummated plural unions would have played right into the RLDS attorney's hands. And this is you're not supposed to be able to really read this, okay, just so you know. But it's a directory that I've put together. If anybody's researching Temple Lot and want a copy, it will be published eventually, but I'd be happy to give that to you. But when you go through, there were 9 of Joseph Smith's plural wives still alive in 1892. Of them, 3 had been polyandrous wives. The first wife that they called was not a polyandrous wife. It was Melissa Lott. Now, she lived 30 miles south in Lehi, and she testified of carnal intercourse with Joseph. That's the word. The second one was Emily Partridge. Emily Partridge lived right there in Salt Lake. She was not a polyandrous wife, and she too testified of having sexual relations with Joseph. And the RLDS attorneys were really very direct. And if you read it, it's remarkable testimony. What's interesting is after this, they skipped all 3 of the polyandrous wives. And yet they were very available, at least 2 of them. Zina Huntington was the church's Relief Society, General Relief Society president. She lived blocks away from where the depositions were being taken in Salt Lake. Skipped her. Didn't ask her to show up. Now, they also skipped Patty Bartlett, but she was 97. Kind of understand that. They also skipped Mary Elizabeth Rawlins, who lived 38 miles north in Ogden. She was well known to the brethren. These women were available if they had wanted to call. Instead, they called Lucy Walker, who lived 82 miles north in Logan, and she came down, got on the train, and came down, and she also testified of sexual relations with Joseph. And just as a sidebar, for those who've been following along the issue of Helen Mar Kimball, they didn't call her, which is curious, because she lived in Salt Lake City. If you read her diary, which was transcribed by Todd Compton, she knew that these people were in town. Her daughter went to hear him speak the Sunday night before the depositions were taken. She was totally available. They didn't call Helen Mar Kimball to testify of her sexual relations as a plural wife of Joseph Smith. She was only 14 when she was sealed to Joseph, and it's still debated whether there was conjugality in that union. This is strong evidence it was not. Now, you could argue, and this is what Todd emailed me this past week, he said maybe they ignored Zina and Mary Elizabeth Rawlins because they wanted to avoid the topic of polyandry. Okay, now that's a logical conclusion, isn't it? I disagree. In 1898, 6 years later, RLDS elder John White asked to interview Zina, and she consented in an interview that was later published. During the interview, he asked her point blank, "Then it is a fact, is it not, that you married Mr. Smith, Joseph? At the same time, you were married to Mr. Jacobs, her legal husband?" Her response, "Well, what right do you have to ask such questions? I was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity." And then in 1905, Mary Elizabeth Rawlins was confronted with the same question. They have the same questions that we have today. And here's her response. "My husband, Adam Leitner, did not belong to the church. I begged and pled with him to join, but he would not. He said he did not believe in it, though he thought a great deal of Joseph. After he said this, I went forth and was sealed to Joseph for eternity." Now, in other places, both of these women said they were sealed for time and eternity, using the standard language of the day. But isn't it interesting, when they were point blank asked about their polyandrous relationships, they said they were sealed for eternity only. If we look at the historical if we look at a historical timeline, what we find is the first report is 1842. The first complaint is 1850. Nobody complains about it for 8 years. That's kind of weird if it was actually happening. But then every reference to plurality of husband by all of these people, some leaders and prominent members, condemns it. But then something happens in 1945. Fawn Brodie wrote in her book, No Man Knows My History, Joseph Smith could with a certain honesty inveigh against adultery in the same week that he slept with another man's wife, or indeed several men's wives, because he had interposed a very special marriage ceremony. And what was the aftermath? And this is a sad chapter in Mormon history. There was no request for her to produce her evidence. Hugh Nibley, one of our best apologists, confronted her on the polygamy issue, but not the polyandry issue. Nothing but silence. In fact, I would assert that Fawn Brodie introduced an elephant into the church history living room. The elephant is that Joseph Smith practiced sexual polyandry. Nobody wanted to touch that. Nobody wanted to acknowledge it was there for decades. And then in 1975, when Dan Bachman, who's a great guy, church educator, and a good friend actually, but when he wrote his thesis, which is remarkable for how much detail he got into, but who did he take his cue from? From the church leaders who condemned it for 100 years? Or from Fawn Brodie? Well, he left the door open for the possibility, and everybody has been following suit. Now, I believe, is the time for transparency on this issue to investigate whether the elephant is real or an inflatable decoy. And let me just add that Fawn Brodie's version of Joseph Smith paints him as a cartoon character and the people around him as dupes that could not possibly pass the test of plausibility in their behavior. I'm venting a little bit, but it's just so silly, the way they portray our ancestors. Now, I do not seek to prove Joseph Smith did not practice sexual polyandry. Such is impossible to do. You can't prove a negative. But what I want to show here is that the evidence supporting it is less credible and less voluminous, that the evidence contradicting it is more credible and more voluminous. So you have to ask, well, why do people keep believing in it? And they will keep believing in it. Well, Richard Bushman hit the nail on the head. He said, polygamy is an interesting thing because it serves as a Rorschach test. People project onto Joseph Smith and the polygamists their own sense about human nature. In other words, they readily assume that sexuality was involved. And now I'm going to quote myself. The only people who can believe God commanded Joseph Smith to practice plural marriage is those who believe God was talking to him in the first place, which isn't very many people. Everybody else is going to assume it, and they're going to be very willing to assume it. These assumptions are going to easily eclipse all of the contradictory evidence. That arrow just keeps going up on how willing people are to assume. So getting back to my title, Joseph Smith's Sexual Polyandry and the Emperor's New Clothes. On closer inspection, what do we find? Assumptions, can't prove a negative, no solid evidence, passionate convictions, no accounting for Joseph Smith's teachings on polyandry, no accounting for the contradictory evidence. Joseph Smith's sealings to legally married women are difficult to understand, but I would affirm that by our standards, that they're strange. They're weird, some of the things that went on, but they did not break the strict law of chastity that Joseph Smith taught. And also, according to all available documents, the faith of the participants in Joseph Smith and his teachings was unaffected by these plural unions. Thanks. Just a couple of questions. How could DNA testing answer some of these questions? How many of you are sticking around for Hugo's presentation? Actually, he's not going to talk about plural marriage today. He already told me, but maybe during the question and answer. And I don't really want to steal his thunder, but he has examined 6, if I remember correctly, and he can correct me. Where is Hugo when he comes up? And he's shown them all to not be applicable. Now, the one real important one is Sylvia Sessions Lyon's daughter, Josephine. And he has studied that. And there is a correlation. The problem is, when they do the genealogy, there's cross-scholarly analysis. You know, it's interesting. I was asked almost the same question at Sunstone a week ago. It's a toughie. The answer is that if you look at Section 132, it allows sexual polygamy in the form of polygyny. Polygyny is polygyny. It's more than one woman, or in this context, more than one wife. In other words, if you read section 132, it tells us that Abraham's already on his throne with his wives. So there's polygamy in that form in the celestial kingdom, but there's nothing mentioned about polyandry in section 132 except the 3 situations, and maybe we want to cut hairs that it says be with another man, asterisks, that doesn't include a legal husband, but I don't read it that way. I think another man includes a legal husband or any other kind of a man. It doesn't matter what hat we want to put on him, that she is not allowed to be with him. That's how I read it. And so all I can say is that section 132 allows for a man to have more than one wife, does not allow for a woman to have more than one husband. And that may not be satisfactory, but the only documents we have from Joseph Smith discussing polygamy is section 132 and a few excerpts in William Clayton's journal, and that is it. And people complain, Brian, go get better documentation. Help me. But I don't think there is any. And I don't think it was ever made. I don't think it exists today. We're stuck with just what we have. But section 132 is really quite clear on what is allowed in heaven and on earth, at least as I read it. And I hope maybe that would answer that.
Thank you very much. A reminder that the artwork that's been so graciously put up, take another good look at it and such, is for sale. Fair gets a portion of those proceeds. Don't forget we have a bookstore outside. And if you'd like to order the conference on MP3s and on video streaming, you can do that here, and you won't get the same deal if you do it later. So that's something, you'll still be able to do it later, but it'll be different pricing structure. With that, we're going to take a 5-minute break.